Hey guys, welcome to the Rebirth podcast. I want to thank you guys for watching and for listening. In this podcast, we talk to individuals that have had to reinvent, recreate, and reimagine in order to grow. But before you watch and listen, I want to remind you to subscribe, to like, to review, and to share this episode and this podcast with everyone that you know. Thank you so much and enjoy. So, Raghunath Cappo, thank you so much for joining the Rebirth podcast, man.
Honored to be here. Inspirational. I think we got to surround ourselves with inspirational people. That's the joy of life.
It is. And the great thing is like when I came to learn about you and your story and your experience, in reading your bio has the word rebirth in it. Which I was like, oh, could it be any more perfect for me to talk to this guy that in his bio talks about having a rebirth and he's going to come on the Rebirth podcast.
Thank you.
And so there's so much that I want to be able to dive into. But for the listener, I want to give them a little bit of context. Of course, I want to get into the work that you're doing today and what you've learned over the last 20 some odd years of your life. I know you've learned a lot and you've done a lot. But for context, I'd love to kind of go back to the earlier days before you became, Raghunath, before you were Ray Cappo and you were the guy that was in a band and just rocking out and living in New York City and doing your thing. And then one day you're just like, no mas. There's another calling for me.
Yeah.
So take us back to being in the Northeast, man.
Well, it was, early 80s. So New York City was a different animal back then. Now it's sort of like a Disneyland, very safe. My mom lives there, but my family grew up in New York. We were raised in Connecticut. And then I just wanted an alternative life. So I always started visiting New York City as a teenager. Got into punk hardcore music in the early 80s, which is sort of like, back then was like completely extreme. Now it probably doesn't sound so extreme. But back then it was
right.
I'm 55. So the 80s rock and roll, mainstream, arena rock, I wanted nothing to do with it. And so I would escape to New York City, find my tribe of, weirdos, freaks, and we'd hang out, we'd make music. And I was always into clean living and health, though, from a young age. And so the punk and hardcore scene was not. So I just started making that part of my identity. And I was into self-improvement. And so that became sort of the theme of our band. And our band was called Youth of Today. And in that band, we had a message of positive living, controlling your mind and your senses. Don't take drugs, don't smoke, don't drink. And we became into plant-based living. And, it was sort of a bold step because you got to understand 80s New York, Lower East Side. People are huffing glue out of a bag. People are taking angel dust. Yeah. It was the cocaine generation. And so it was sort of like a bold statement. And that's just what we were into. But what happened was it sort of snowballed into a relatable thing that kids that age, I say kids, we were all in our teenagers and our fans were teenagers. It just took off. The music was really loud, really aggressive. I was a psycho, but the message was really about self-improvement, self-betterment, personal edification, and rebirth. Rebirth. Rebirthing yourself.
Yeah. So where does this, when you hear that, I'm like, okay, but where's the plant? Where's the seed? Who planted the seed for you? I'm just going to talk about you right now, like in not your bandmate so much, but you to start saying, this is the life that I want to follow. I want to follow this health conscious, this activist, lifestyle. Like, what was it? Was it someone at home? Was it a family? Because I know, like my wife, for example, she talks about an aunt that, when she went to go stay with her when she was like 11 years old, and she came back home to New York City because my wife's from New York City, born and raised Queens girl.
Oh, wow.
And she came home to my in-laws and she was like, okay, so I'm a vegetarian now. And they were like, what? And like, oh, you
like you hang out with a vegetarian, and then all of a sudden, it happens.
And so like I was like, oh my God, right? It's just crazy how you're easily like shaped and molded when you're a child trying to figure out the world and your role in it. Was there anybody that was that influence to get Ray to think in this way?
I think there's a lot of different influences, because the punk and the hardcore scene always had interesting elements and sort of like extreme philosophies, ideas, some that didn't stick with me whatsoever, and some that I sort of latched onto. There was something in my being that liked the idea of discipline and self-control. And when we say in our being, then you could give the credit to the parents, or you could give the credit to not wanting to be like my parents. My parents were pretty cool. But in the yoga world, which is, my background, is you also get what's called samskaras, or impressions from your previous life, because they say that the subtle body travels with your soul, or with yourself, or with your atma. So the subtle body is also coming. That's why even if you have twins, like I have 5 kids, so even if you have kids that are, you raise them the same, you treat them the same, you give them both the same privilege, both the same discipline. One kid could go north, one kid could go south. Every parent knows that. Even twins, it could happen. And so, the yogis say that it's not necessarily what the parents are giving the kids. It's these kids are coming in with their own backstory, and no matter how much you even try, it's just like no matter how much I try to cultivate a watermelon seed to grow up to be an apple tree, it's still going to be a watermelon.
There's nothing you could do to try to mold it.
Yeah, and I'm sure with
you just gotta get to a point where you say, I like watermelon, and just accept it for what it is.
You do. You have to let go a little, especially as if you're raising kids or raising teenagers. You get to that point where like, oh, I thought I had control of this kid. I have no control whatsoever.
Yes.
So yeah, but there was many like positive forces in the music scene, bands, Minor Threat, 7 Seconds. These were just bands I listened to and inspired me, because that scene was also very violent, and I could have easily took a turn towards south and got really violent, but there were some inspirational bands there. And then I got more and more interested in animal rights, which wasn't a big thing. It wasn't really even in the conversation in the 80s. But I did realize that I don't want to do these things for ego. And then I started getting into all this Eastern thought, all these Eastern teachings would deal with like, okay, big deal. You're not smoking, you're not drinking, you're not taking drugs, you're not eating meat. Big deal. You have a massive ego that you're dealing with. And if you're doing this stuff for the ego, it's good in one sense, in the basic idea of self-control. But if you want to go to these higher echelons, you got to start wrestling with this bigger demon of the ego, because the ego is the thing that's really causing us a lot of pain in this life. We get self-inflated, narcissistic, ruin relationships, ruin our friendships, and really ruin our own personal joy. So all that stuff, what happened was in my life, our music band, around us, a massive scene of kids who didn't, and it was international, that didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't eat meat, grew. But it became a little bit settled in the ego, which was like, we don't do this, and you should be like us. And for me, it sort of struck a chord with me, because I was I had the biggest mouth about it, and then I started realizing this can't be the end. This has to be a threshold to something greater. And then as these yoga literature. When I say yoga literature, I don't mean books on stretching or physical therapy. I mean the classic ancient books of India, which deal less with physical practice and more with the real things that are like just weighing heavy on our mind, or stealing our joy, and which is the control of the mind and the control of the senses and the wrestling with the ego and how to deal with that. And so at a certain point at the height of my band, I just had to leave and say, you know what, this is a good thing, but I need something more to my life. And I just walked away. My bandmates were pissed off, but it was like a new chapter. And sometimes I think we have to walk away from everything that we know is normal to rebirth. And that's what it is.
Yeah.
And it's a great name for a podcast, by the way. I just want to share that because we're always rebirthing. We're rebirthing every thought we think. Every thought we think, JR. Yep. It's like we have a chance. And I feel like
literally every single day is a rebirth, has the potential to be a rebirth. And it's every choice, every decision in our day. I mean, literally, that's how micro it is. It's I think some people think of rebirth as it has to be this traumatic event, which it was for me, right? But it's not always the case. As I've learned since that big thing, I realized it's all this micro stuff, like at a micro level, these day-to-day simple choices, decisions. Do I choose to forgive? Do I choose to love? Do I choose to be fearless? Do I choose to, be forgiving? Like how do I, what do I want to influence? Do I want to help? Why do I do what I do every single day, and making that choice to show up and do it in the most authentic way that I possibly can? And so for me, that's what I really want people to understand, is that a rebirth doesn't have to be this intimidating thing of, oh my God, what's my rebirth? I didn't have anything traumatic happen to me yet. And it's like, well, it doesn't have to be. Right. It doesn't have to be that, right? Like you look at your life and, here you are, a teenager into your early 20s, like literally 2021. You're rocking out. I mean, you guys started a little record label. You signed bands. Like, I mean, where were your parents? Were your parents cool with this, or did they just kind of like? Because you said I heard you say earlier that.
I said my parents were. I was 6 out of 7 kids. And I know it's like after raising those kids, by the time you get down to the bottom, you're like, okay, kids, do whatever you want to do. So they were sort of cool with me going to New York City when I was 14 years old on my own. I had older brothers that lived in New York City, where your wife is from, in Queens, and we just used to hang out on the weekends. So that was freeing. My father, at the time I started my band, my father went into a coma, and he was in a coma for 3 years. That was his trauma. It wasn't my trauma, but dealing with it became traumatic. And it became traumatic for my whole family. And then he finally left his body. And when he did, that was my signal. And I think that type of trauma, like you're saying, so these major types of trauma that you've had, or sometimes when an alcoholic hits a rock bottom, there's a beauty to that. There's either a beauty or a bitterness that can probably go hand in hand. And I'm sure not everybody bounced back like you've taken everything and gone so high with it. And some people don't go; they go way south, or they die, or they're the living dead, which is even worse. So when my father went into that coma like that, first of all, I couldn't cope with it. I'm not proud to say I really just checked out, because it's a weird state of not nearly being alive or dead. And I had no answers. I feel like half my family thought he was alive, half my family thought he was dead. And I couldn't, as an 18-year-old, I couldn't really cope with it myself. So my mother just encouraged me, just do your music thing. And then I think what it did point me in the direction of this, my spiritual path, was there's nothing solid in this material world, not even a very solid, Catholic family. It's, with 7 kids, that's not solid. Nothing is solid. And that was sort of like the reminder in my mind again and again, what is solid in this world? Or as like Tolstoy says, like it's everything's running through my hands. What will not get stripped away from me by the cruel hands of time? And I started thinking, like, where is there? What can I hold on to? And that got me more into the subtle. And I realized the subtle is the solid. the gross is actually all temporary. Everything, even my things that appear, my wife, my children, my home, we lose them all. And I was getting these like very deep realizations at a young age. And at that point, at 22, that was what really triggered me. And there were books. The Bhagavad Gita was a book that really struck my heart. I felt it was a deep book of spiritual wisdom that was appreciated by Thoreau and Emerson and Oppenheimer and Mark Twain. And so I dove into that Eastern path because I loved the very broad, I call it the wide-gated understanding of spirituality. That everybody, in fact, is a spirit soul. It doesn't matter what religion they are, or what background they're from, or what ethnicity they are, or even if they're not, even if they're an atheist, we are spiritual beings, and we just forgot. And we're identifying with our gender, or our race, or our nation, or our politics. And whenever we do that, we get ourselves in trouble, and we create an other. So the part of even the part of my vegetarianism was a type of although I was into health and I was into yoga and I was into being physical, I got into it because I started trying to see all living beings as living beings struggling like me in this world. And when I did it like that, it changed my vantage point of even health, but it changed my goggles of how I see the world.
So at 22 years old, you step away from everything, right? Everything that we as the world would look at and say, why would you step away from that, right? Like, you're successful, you have fans, you guys started a record label, you signed 20 bands, like, you're doing your thing, you're living in New York City. Like, I mean, you're doing your thing. And then at 22, you're like, nope, I'm going to search for this deeper thing. And so you go to India, and that was, what was it, 1988? Is that what it was? The year, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah. And it was truthfully, it was a few days after my father had left his body.
Wow. And you said, you mentioned how that was one of the best choices of your life. And what I'm curious about is, how does this kid from New York, Connecticut, all of a sudden find himself in the middle of India somewhere? And how do you know where to go? Like, how do you know, like, what is that process like? Especially back then, where there's no phones, no internet, like, where you could just be like, I'm going to Google this resort and book it.
There's no TripAdvisor. It's unbelievable how we did anything. You'd have to write.
Like, what'd you do? Take the house phone with you and just connect it into every port that you found? Like, what? How did, like, this is?
I don't even know
that's crazy to me.
I don't even know how we got around without cell phones back then. Or our bands would go on tour, and we'd have to, pull over at a payphone, have a bag of dimes and quarters and stuff like that. But it was weird because you'd have to like mail letters ahead of time to find places and books. And, hi, I'm thinking about going to India and like to stay at your ashram. Do you have space for me? What would that entail? Blah, blah, blah. And that's how we connected. But I will say that in that disconnected world, it made a real magical experience, because when you got nothing, you're left to like trust God or the universe, I went to India with no credit cards. That's not even hard to believe nowadays. I had no credit card. I don't go anywhere without a credit card now. But when you have no credit card, I remember I was trying to get back once, and I had $1 in my pocket, and I had a ticket, but I had $1 in my pocket. But for some reason, at the 11th hour, someone asked me to carry some trunks for them back to America. This was before 9/11. But they wouldn't let me on the plane with all this extra baggage. And I was like, well, it's not mine. It's for a friend. He goes, oh, you want to carry other people's baggage? Now you really can't get on the plane. I was like, I have to get on the plane. I have $1. And I was dressed in robes and a long beard. I said, you have to let me on the plane. I only have $1. And he said, I'm sorry. The plane has just left. And I was like, I look around and no one's here. And I was like, what do you mean the plane is left? I literally got up on the luggage scale. I said, sir, please, And I this sounds so silly and humiliating. I haven't said this in many years, but I bowed down to the guy who was like in charge of Delta Airlines. I said, "Sir, please, I'm a monk. I have no money whatsoever." And he goes, "Well, you're going to need at least $100 because that's what it's going to cost to change your ticket. And your ticket, and the next plane out of here is not till Thursday." I was like, "What?" And he just walked away. So here I am with 3 trunks, $1, no ticket home,
and your robe,
in a robe, in a backpack, and it's in those destitute situations that you find magic. You know what I mean? Magic happens. At least I can say in my situation where I've had no one to turn to but throw my hands up in the air and say, "Oh God, what do you want from me in this life? What do you want from me in this situation?" In those situations, the magic happens. At least that's what my realization.
So was there?
It worked out great.
What was the What was the magic in that situation? Because now I got to know the ending.
The ending worked out perfect. I had a friend who was like one of the funniest guys I've ever met, American guy, who was also a monk. He was living in New Delhi in an ashram. I somehow contacted him. He said, "Yeah, just get on a bus. Leave those things." Back then, you could leave trunks in storage. Leave all that stuff in storage. Come to New Delhi. I'll totally take care of you. I've got plenty of money. I live on the roof of this ashram. Don't worry about it. And I had the best. I ended up extending my stay. I had the best, few extra weeks just walking around learning about Delhi. The next day was a big.
So the person that asked you to take these trunks
was some other person.
Now,
it was a random person I knew from New York that was asking them to bring them to some ashram in New York. The story.
So now that stuff is like in a storage unit
before cell phones. It's like, hey, someone dropped, "Hey, please do this for me." How am I supposed to carry 3 trunks back? Well, I could carry 2. Everybody's allowed 2 back then. And I had no personal belongings, so I didn't have anything. So yeah, and I had another guy that was with me that he would be able to carry 2. Also, he was a monk also, and he just never showed up. And so now I have 3. And my big thing was I have no idea where my friend is. He's missing.
Oh my gosh!
So that's a big.
There's so many elements to that story.
Oh yeah, I have a friend that's missing in India now. He's missing, and because there's no cell phone, I can't reach him. Turns out he got all his things stolen, and back then you could not get a passport quick. I mean, traveling in the 80s was like a whole different beast. Once 1991 came and the internet came and cell phones came, that was a whole different animal. The place I stayed had one phone in the village.
And in 1991 is actually when you were initiated and you received your name, which you were no longer. Man, like you're a fascinating guy, and I just love the story, and I want to be able to like transition into what you discovered in the 6.5 years of becoming a monk, and then of course everything you do now. But like, yeah, man, I found myself just going down this rabbit hole of just learning about your life and learning about your story and learning about the things you talk about. And it's so fascinating to me, but in a very inspiring way. Like it really is inspiring because, there's so many things that we are, pressured to believe that this is how we obtain success and happiness. Right. And I think because I was telling my wife this the other day, I realize why when I'm around people that I frequently have contact with that keep telling me they want to do something, and we talk about it, and I try to give them the best advice that I can. I try to listen, and then I try to give them the best advice. And then, a few days go by or a few weeks go by, in some cases a few months, and they're still talking about, I want to do. And I told her, I was like, it's a trigger for me. It's a trigger for me because like I have this deeper appreciation of life than most because I almost lost it. And when to your point earlier, when you almost lose everything or have almost nothing, you learn to appreciate what you do have. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when I look at people that have, which I perceive as every opportunity because they're alive.
Sure.
That's where it starts for me.
Sure.
Like, you're alive, so you have every opportunity. Now, beyond that is a bonus, man. You know, like it triggers me, right? And so when I don't know, just that's a whole other rant of, you know, with me. But the point is that when I started reading into your story and everything, I was just like, oh my God, this guy, he is everything that he's talking about. Like, I'm ready to go with you now to India. Like, I'm ready. Like, I'm ready to book.
I'd love to hang out
Let's
with you
go.
for
But
a
I'm
few
taking a
weeks.
cell phone. I'm going to have more than $1, and I'm going to have a map just in case I lose you.
I even
all
stay
right?
in hotels now. Don't get me wrong.
Oh my God, it's a whole other experience.
You know what? When I started taking groups to India about 17 years ago, I had never stayed in a hotel before. I always just slept on floors. So I wasn't used to it. I was like, wow, this is weird, man. I got a blanket. I got my own blanket here. And it's, you know, it's not cement. There's actually a bed here. It was very foreign for me.
Pillows.
Yeah.
And more pillows than you actually need.
More pillows than you practically need.
Which I believe all of those pillows, like a hotel, I think for any single guy that stays in a hotel by himself, I think you should just look at that as preparation for marriage. Because I don't know about you, but my wife has 17 pillows on the bed.
Pillow collections? What's with the pillow collections?
I don't
What is that about?
know.
I can't figure it out myself.
I'm like, why?
I don't even like one pillow that much. I don't like one pillow. I don't like 11.
I'm like,
you gotta dismantle your entire bed before you.
The whole thing. It's a breakdown. It's like a whole shift. Who's doing the shift? And then we both look at each other like, are you going to take all the, oh, you didn't, and it's like, yeah, because it's so much work. Why can't we just leave the two pillows that we utilize?
Anyway, like, who's coming up in our bedroom?
God, it's insane, man. It's insane. But here you are in 1991. That's when you essentially have your rebirth, right? Like, Ray is no longer.
Another rebirth. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
by the way,
Ray is no longer.
I want to interrupt, sir. I just want to say,
of course,
hearing the accolades from you, I'm incredibly humbled. I appreciate you so much, and reading up on your story was incredibly inspiring as well. So, thank you for
thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you for accepting the invitation to come on the podcast.
My pleasure.
But I don't want the listener to be like, oh, this is turning into a bro fest, a love fest, right? Which it is. And we can have a whole nother episode, right? It can be. What's wrong with that? But I really do appreciate you coming on the podcast, man. I think this is just a dope story. And so again, in 1991, Ray is no more, right? And now you are Raghunath, right? And this new person. But tell me about those 6.5 years of being a monk, and what did you learn? I know you talked about how you went from having essentially just a robe and learning how to appreciate just having that robe and looking at the world through a very different lens.
I shared this on Joe Rogan, but it's worth sharing again. When I first went there, I didn't quite get it because when I first went to India, I was a musician, so I wasn't rich, but I had about 20. I'm 22. I had $25,000 saved, and I was a New Yorker, so I was a cynic of not trusting of anybody. People want my money.
Yeah.
Who are these monks? Who are the gurus or the swamis? And so I started hanging with the monks. Now you got to understand, this was also India, 1988. There was no pleasures, like the comforts that we get as Americans. We take for granted. You got heat. Heat's a comfort. India is tropical, subtropical, but it gets cold in the winter, and there was no heat where we stayed, at least in these cement rooms. There's no beds. Most people wore no shoes. It gets hot when it gets hot. And when it's cold in the winter, it gets really cold. When it gets in the summertime, you could fry an egg on the sidewalk. So,
oh my gosh.
And also you're going to bed super early. You go to bed at 8:30. You're waking up at 2:30, 3:30. You're not going to the movies. You're not having sex. You're not watching TV. There's no Netflix. There's no internet. Where are you getting your pleasure from? So it seems like with all that fun stuff taken away, we should be bored out of our minds. Yet I noticed that the monks had this like deep connected joy. And I realized, like, I'm so worried that these guys are going to try to take my money. They have nothing and they're happy and they're really happy. And I want what they have. How do they get that? If I could figure this out, if I could figure out how to walk this slack line and figure out how to find deep joy with nothing, wow, that could be great. Because even then, even if you have stuff, because you fully realize that you could lose it at any minute. That's what drives people really crazy. They have stuff, they lose everything. But how to actually have nothing and find that connection and that deep smile on your face that you get from like just feeling it. And that was my biggest faith builder. Not anything anybody said to me, not some sacred book, not some, priest or swami. It was seeing the inherent joy of people with little to nothing and controlling their senses and going inside to find their pleasure. Whereas I've been trained to go outside everywhere for my pleasure. My pleasure is I must travel here. I must, hook up with him or with her. I must, accumulate this. And so what the monks do is they just deprive themselves. They voluntarily deprive themselves so they're left with nothing except whatever, spiritual traditions process you have to go inside. And I realized, okay, now I know what the work is. Shut everything out and go in. And that was like a very beautiful practice. And it started with waking up at 2:30 and going into these jailhouse showers and taking cold showers in the morning and, wearing these Brahmin underwear that strap your crotch down and, wearing robes and walking around barefoot and on marble until you feel it in your bones. And, and trying to be of service,
When you and I want to circle back to that being of service soundbite because that is so important. But when you finally went in and you understood that you had to go in, was it intimidating? Did you discover things about yourself that maybe weren't so pleasant, or was it just kind of like this clean slate and just learning and then hopefully reestablishing the foundation that you already had?
That's a great question, JR. My teacher writes a book. I'll give it a plug right now. A Journey Home, Autobiography of an American Swami by Raghunath Swami. But it is such a great book, but he had a different mindset. He went to India hitchhiking already, like he was already almost like a hermit in his mind. He was already really renounced. He went right to the Himalayas, start to live with these masters in caves. He started off with a 30-day fast. It was like the whole thing was impressive. Mine wasn't as impressive. Mine was constant self-doubt, constant checking in, constant like, what the hell am I doing here? But in that process, it made me not be a fanatic. It made me work in increments that I really got. Okay, I get this. I'm gonna keep going with this. Okay, I don't get that, but I'll put that on hold. But I'm gonna take a step forward. Okay, I fully get this now. Now I'm going to take another step forward. So I didn't just opt in and say, okay, I'm join the club. And I don't think faith and spiritual faith in its most authentic way will be like that. My students, in my own students, I don't ask them to accept anything. I say, accept what makes sense to you. But if it doesn't make sense, don't take massive leaps of faith. Or else what's going to happen is there'll be no roots to those trees. And when you get challenged, those trees will just blow down. So we develop our roots from living it and from experiencing joy and some connection and some philosophical understanding and some realization. And there's still things I don't understand that are esoteric and lofty. But I feel like I've gone those other steps first with that critical mind.
And have you found that by having done all that work that you did in those 6.5 years that you were there as a monk, everything that you've experienced since then, when you encounter a moment where you have to question or ask yourself, that you're able to remind yourself of what you've already done and what you've already overcome. So then it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a piece of cake, whatever the new adversity is. It just means that you at least have a little confidence of knowing I can navigate through this, because I just have to get back to the basics, back to the basic teachings and the things that I learned.
Sure. Sometimes I hear these Navy SEALs or Army Rangers or stuff, and or anybody who's been through a boot camp, even an athlete or something. That doesn't mean they can't become out of shape or an alcoholic after they graduate that program. But so in that sense, I don't feel like I was scot-free, but at the same time, I felt like it gave me some type of gold standard to hold on to when things are tough. I mean, now I have a house, we have a farm, I have 5 kids, I have, married. But I know
complete opposite of a monk.
The complete opposite of being a monk. It doesn't get any more unmonk than this. I got a car, I got a tractor, I got a chainsaw, I got, So it's actually the opposite. But I know that, when I don't have false illusions of happiness coming from stuff. I don't think there's any amount of stuff that's going to make me happy. But I do understand that at any moment I can lose everything. And I do understand that my joy is not dependent on a thing. And I think that is a beautiful realization to take with me. And it helps me not run down these dead ends. Sometimes there's very long, windy, beautiful dead ends. They go nowhere. Like, if you just get this, you'll be happy. If you just get this certain amount of validation, you'll be happy. If you just get, and it goes on and on forever. And people spend their whole life chasing it. If I only get to this part of the ladder of success, I will be satisfied. And I see it all the time. I meet people who, and I'm sure you have too, who've climbed that material level of success, and they realize, I don't even want to be here. I've climbed the ladder. I've given the time. I've put in the resources. Big deal. And I think this is one of these things that we suffer from in America or in the West, where there is so much opportunity. We've indulged in so much. We're just almost like stuffed. Like I'm grossed out. And we're naturally, everything's going smaller. I want a tiny home. I want a small piece of land. We're naturally doing the pendulum swing. I got to keep it simple. Stuff that the monks have been talking about forever. Keep it simple.
Right.
Simple living, high thinking,
It's funny because I call this the Pinata Effect. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever been at a party where there's a piñata, or, what you see is whoever the person is that just breaks that thing open, snaps that thing open, everything, whatever it is, dumps out. And what do you see? For the most part, kids just bum rushing to the center to grab everything that they can. They don't even know what they're grabbing. They're grabbing stuff. Then you hear some kids crying because, of course, it's been a head collision in the center of this, where this pile. Yeah, exactly. But then what you see is like they grab everything that they can, and then they kind of go back to their base and then sort out and then figure out. And I believe that is a lot of what we do as humans. We feel that we have to go and collect everything. The problem is that we never go back and say, okay, do I need to be doing this? Do I really need that? We don't do that self-inventory, and we feel that we have to be all things and everything to everything that we actually gathered. And I really apply this when it comes to people, work, right? Entrepreneurs or companies. Like, you think of people that, I got to have as many clients as I possibly can because I got to have that revenue coming in. And it's like, yeah, but you can have and do all of these events or have all these clients. But if you're not showing up 100% for every single one of them, then what's the point?
Yeah.
It's better off just kind of wash away and focus on one, do 100%, and you will feel more fulfilled, and that person will be more fulfilled, versus us feeling the need to be that very thing for 50 or 75 pieces of candy that came out of this freaking piñata.
That's beautiful.
And it's crazy, man. And so like and so for me, that's what one of the things that I love is, where I live in Austin, Texas. I mean, it's an, affluent neighborhood, and a lot of people have stuff, and I'm not going to sit here and look at them and say, well, they're not happy. That's a cover up. No, I don't know. But I mean, it's very easy to fall into this space of, we got to keep up with the Joneses, right? Like you got to, they got a brand new car this year. Well, why don't I get one?
Sure.
Why don't I get one? Right? Like, and so I'm curious because I know that now, like, as you alluded to, you're married, 5 kids, living upstate New York, but you and your wife started a yoga studio. And I know that not only, you mentioned earlier, you take people back to the cities and villages around India where you spent time, but you now help bring these teachings to people that either come to your studio or, have interaction with you. And what I'm curious about is when you're sharing all of what you've learned and what you and your wife, I'm assuming, apply every single day, or at least really try to apply every single day, because life is hard and it's difficult to always do it. What's the reception like from people? Like, is it like, no way I can live that life, no way that I can, just bury it down to just simplistic stuff? I mean,
Sure.
what do people say?
Another good question. I think the way my passion is study those ancient teachings, and then I got to apply them as a monk, as a renunciate. And then I went through a very difficult period of trying to, like, how do I find that middle path in the world, but not of the world? And that took me some time to get there, because coming out of an ashram is sort of like, how do I deal with this material world? It's like overwhelming.
Right.
Like I don't want to indulge, but I don't want to be a monk anymore. What is that middle path? So it took me time to get that. And I think that's sort of what I can contribute now, like how to apply these things. And it's different for everybody. Some people need to do less.
Right.
Like a lot of times in this potentiality idea of, you need to do more, you need to step into bigger shoes, you have so much potential. Sometimes people actually need to step into bigger shoes. Sometimes they need to do less. They've been taking on too much. They need to cut it way back. So I think it's going to be very unique for where people are at. I think it's important to sort of see your life and what we value, what are our real values, and also check in, which is like, what are we good at? What are we great at? Are we communicators? Are we musicians? Are we artists? Have I put my real passions on hold because what will people think of me? Some fear of failure, things like that. I think there has to be a connection to what this gift that we have is, and then we have to figure out how to take that gift and give back with that gift. So there's really two things I feel is people first have to identify, I'm born with a gift. How can I give back? And first identify what that gift is. Sometimes we know, and sometimes we know, but we're like keeping it buried in a shoebox on our shelf somewhere. We got to figure out what that gift is. And then we got to present that gift. Now, some of us are already feeling like, no, I'm living my gift right now. And if we're in that position, we just have to refine that gift, refine the offering, make it more significant, more powerful. And a lot of that work is the refining of ourself and our own habits and our own thoughts and the way we treat people and the stuff I put in my ears and my eyes and my mouth, and which is going to definitely affect what comes out of my mouth. So yeah, it really depends. There'll be with a group, like I'm taking about 20, 25 people, 27, 28 people to Nepal next week. And it's a spiritual pilgrimage because Nepal is a spiritual place. It was an old kingdom of India. They preserved Vedic teachings. It became its own country. It's got 1,300, Himalayan peaks in it. So we'll do half trekking, half holy places. But every day I'll give a morning and evening. We call them satsangs. We're like spiritual discourses. And in those satsangs, we'll find that as different as we are, we're all very similar. We all experience love, and then we all experience heartbreak. We all experience getting things, and we all experience losing things. We all experience birth, and we all experience death. And this has been going on forever. We all have very similar experience. And when we speak about these things and start to understand these things and understand what is of value and what are things of value, but we have to also let go of, it resonates with everybody. So I think on these general pilgrimages, they go very deep, very quick, and we're around we have parameters of how we behave in that group on a pilgrimage. And it makes for the entrance to go very, very deep, very, very quick. But people will take away different things depending on where their consciousness is at. Some people have hit a rock bottom in their life, and they're really, I'm going to change my life. One guy came back from a pilgrimage once. He's like, how was pilgrimage? I go, it was incredible. We went here and we sat there and chanted and sang at this holy temple. And the first thing he said to me was, I heard there's a lot of hot girls on pilgrimage. And I was thinking to myself, man, it's amazing what comes out of people's mouth. But it just shows, like, whatever situation you're in, wherever your head's at, that's what you're going to get out of the situation. So you can bring a group of people, but everybody's sort of at a different place. I know a lot of the things that I heard, that really inspired me to go, springboard in my spiritual life. If I heard them 3 years previously, 5 years would have made any sense whatsoever. So it has to be ripe. It has to be really ripe. If you eat that mango too early, it's green. If you eat it real early, it's astringent. If you eat it at the right time, it's perfectly sweet. And
right.
Yeah.
Is that the service? Is that the service now that you mentioned earlier, like, connecting to this life of service and how you can be of service? Is that the service now that you give and contribute to other people, as helping them navigate through this world and hopefully being able to connect to their core?
Exactly. I feel like if I can give that back, then it's a type of like repaying all my teachers who've just tolerated me and dealt with me and my insanity and just sucked it up and loved me anyway.
Your New York ways.
I'm rough around the edges. Yeah, I'm not a great...
Listen, I'm married one, man. I know. I spent a lot of time in New York City. I love them to death, but Lord, I know. I try to convince my wife before we moved here to Austin. I would tell her, I was like, because I was born and raised in the South, and I would tell her, I was like, yo, babe, I'm just telling you, it's a thing. Like, where in New York, people, doesn't mean they're mean or they're evil spirited. It just means that in New York, there's a lot of distraction. You got people coming up to you every day. You're moving, right? You're moving.
They're like
you got things to do. You got somewhere to be.
Spiny with a hard shell, but sweet inside.
Yes, I love that. I love that.
Outside, though.
Well, the realities of a virtual world are still amongst us. Yes, the reason you're looking at me and not at Raghunath or myself is because we lost the rest of his audio. Not sure why, it just happened. And I'm disappointed, yes, for you, because you've been listening and watching, and trust me, there were so many like golden moments and knowledge and wisdom that he was dropping. But it's okay. It just gives me an excuse to reach back out to him and say, hey, let's do this again. And maybe since the world is starting to open up again, maybe we could do this in person. Who knows? But in the meantime, I want to thank Raghunath for coming on and just sharing his wisdom and his knowledge, his life story, his rebirth. I want to thank every single one of you for watching, for listening, for supporting, for subscribing, for sharing, for reviewing, all of that good stuff. I also want to remind you that if you want to learn more about other guests or future guests, you can hit me up on Instagram at @IamJRMartinez. Until then, my friends, this is Rebirth.